Please, now we are going to hear Mohammad Amin SHAKERI. Please, if you want to speak, you can do now.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Hello everyone. I'm glad that this conference is finally held, even if it's only online. As you can see on your screens, my topic today, unlike two other contributions in this session, deals in fact with a syntactical problem and concerns Hjelmslev's argument against Meillet's sentence theory regarding the problem of the nominal sentence. In my presentation, after a short introduction and some historical points about the relation Hjelmslev-Meillet, I will briefly present their works on the subject matter of the nominal sentence. Then I will look closer and examine how Hjelmslev reads and refutes Meillet's maxims about the theory of sentence labeled as classical doctrine. Finally, we will see Hjelmslev's proposals supplemented with some suggestions to pursue his theory with syntactic problems by virtue of uh, reading his particular analysis. Nominal sentence, which is also called averbal or verbless sentence, uh, is a construction that is observed in the usage of almost all languages. The frequency of its use is different from one language to another. For example, in some languages like Arabic, Hebrew, Egyptian, Russian, and some ancient Indo-European languages, nominal sentences are widely used as the obligatory or main predicative sentence structure under certain defined grammatical conditions, while in other languages such as English, French, Persian, etc., the use of this construction is limited to certain specified context or particular styles. All in all, leaving aside the question of the frequency of use, and in either a general or universal perspective, one can say in agreement with Grappi that the analysis of this construction can be problematic for any grammatical theory of the sentence, especially those long-term Western classical grammars which are mainly verb-centered. It seems proper to first take a glance at the relationship between the two scholars. Louis Hjelmslev, founder of Glossematic, after having read Saussure's Cours de linguistique générale for the first time in 1925, decided to stay 2 years in Paris in 1926 and 1927 to assist the lectures of the French linguists, in particular those of the great Antoine Meillet. This stay became decisive for his future development. The result of this his close contact with the important Parisian linguists and his dense reading of a large number of theoretical works in linguistics was the emergence of his first major work, Principe de grammaire générale, the book that played the role of the groundwork for his later most rigorous and ambitious Glossematic program. The Parisian master had an encouraging attitude towards the works and thoughts of his Danish student, with nevertheless a caustic criticism. He wrote two reviews on the works of the young Hjelmslev. You see here some quotes that I prefer to skip for saving the time. On the other hand, Louis Hjelmslev always referred to his master with great respect and recognition. However, he also raised some sharp and serious criticism of the approach of Meillet and his colleague. These critics focus mainly on the idiosyncratic studies of languages with a semantically and sociologically biased approach that has made their theory transcendent in Hjelmslevian sense of the term. In 1944, Hjelmslev, referring to the works of Meillet and his colleagues, writes that their results certainly must be subjected to a deep revision. This deep revision is once performed on a syntactic problem in Hjelmslev's article entitled Le verbe et la phrase nominale, published in 1948, which is an expanded version of his previous lecture, Base et caractéristiques, verbe et phrase nominale, presented on September the 5th, 1946, to the Linguistic Circle of Copenhagen. This study belongs to the period in which Hjelmslev's version of Glossematic calculus, which he calls Sprock theory, has reached a proper certitude. In this article, he bases his study, among others, on Meillet's analysis of Indo-European nominal sentences. Meillet, in his Mémoire, La phrase nominale en Indo-European, founded the theory of the nominal sentence with a framework of, as he himself calls it, modern linguistics. His work served as a model of the studies of other French linguists, including Marouzeau, Bloch, Saclot, and Gutiot. The main objective of this memoir was to decline the theoretical and a priori hypothesis of Delbruck and to show how the nominal sentences in Indo-European are constructions which coexist with the sentences with the verb to be, and determines how determine the conditions where the use of nominal sentences is sometimes preferred over the copular sentences. Meillet's study, as well as the works of the Parisian scholars, are apparently idiosyncratic analysis carried out in a comparative historical perspective. However, Hjelmslev look at them from his own perspective, which is in fact from general grammar or general theory of language point of view. He deduces a body of doctrine consisted of four statements supposed to be presumed by all these French linguists and shared with most traditional grammars. Without explicitly attributing this set of statements to Meillet, Hjelmslev labels it as classical doctrine. Curiously, I traced these four statements in Meillet's works and concluded that the so-called classical doctrine largely matches Meillet's maxims for the theory of sentence. You can see in this table some references to Meillet's works corresponding to each statement. Now let's take a look at the statements of this so-called classical doctrine. The first one, which is a universal definition, defines a verb as a word that, conserving its meaning, indicates a process, if not a predication. The second, as a general definition of the verb, indicates that a verb is a conjugated word. The third statement is a general theorem, which determines verb as a main class of words, which is essentially opposed to that of nouns. And the last statement assumes verb and its verbal elements as essential parts of the proposition and defines a nominal sentence as a proposition evacuated from its verbal elements. Hjelmslev refutes this set of statements and offer an alternative to serving in favor of his own immanent approach. To do this, he first performs a detailed analysis of nominal sentences in Latin Then he generalizes his results to any language with nominal verbal morphemes. Here, without going into detail, we will only see an overview of his arguments and analysis tools used that led him to his unconventional results. So, as might be accepted, the first statement remains out of the discussion and is outright rejected, first because it is semantic, vague, and non-structural. Second, because there are unrestricted counter cases. For example, there is an infinite number of nouns like thought, conversation, etc., which also express a process. But the following three general statements, which are interconnected, are decisive for Hjelmslev's arguments. Starting from the fourth statement, a statement which attributes the so-called verbal elements, this means the categories of tense, aspect, mood, etc., only to the verb and therefore to the verbal sentence. Here, Hjelmslev uses the commutation test to disprove this statement. According to this test, by paradigmatically replacing a chain component in one of the planes, expression or content, if a necessary replacement occurs in the other plane, the two components should be registered as invariants. We see here one of his examples from Latin, omnia parae clara rara, all excellent things rare. In this nominal sentence, by changing aspect, tense, or mood, we are required to add a verb and therefore to use a verbal sentence. For example, if we want to express this sentence in the past tense, it is necessary to use the verb around. Thereby, this test results in the mandatory registration of aspect, tense, and mood, also for any nominal sentence, or nominal sentences in Latin here. There are two other verbal elements in Meillet's analysis of Latin sentences, those of person and voice. Hjelmslev argues that we should also register them for nominal sentences, but this time as syncretism. This interpolation makes the description coherent and yields a simpler description of the sentence without causing any contradiction. This kind of interpolation is called catalysis in Glossematic terminology. Up to this point, Hjelmslev registered 5 categories which are common to verbal and nominal sentences. But he asks, what is the difference between a nominal sentence like omnia parae clara rara and its verbal counterpart omnia parae clara sunt rara? They seem to be mostly the same regarding these 5 categories. Here, Hjelmslev introduces or catalyzes a 6th category that guarantees the commutation between a nominal sentence and its verbal counterpart. He calls this new category relief and argues that in a Latin verbal sentence we have a normal degree of relief, while in a nominal sentence the relief is in excessive degree. So, come to the point, by these investigations, Hjelmslev achieves an alternative general law as follows. Every nominal sentence contains in its contents certain elements that traditional grammar should logically recognize as verbal elements, without necessarily having a verb. After showing that this analysis is valid not only for predicative nominal sentences but also for all non-predicative ones, Hjelmslev asks the next question. Which interpretation should we choose concerning the relation of the verb and the nominal sentence? Should we interpolate or catalyze a zero expression verb, that is to say, as an implied verb or an ellipsis, to the nominal sentence, exactly like what we did with so-called verbal elements morphemes? Or should we interpret the nominal sentence as having no verb at all? Hjelmslev strongly argues in favor of the second interpretation because the addition of a verb to the nominal sentence, to which it is already catalyzed, the so-called verbal morphemes, will be a catalysis of the second degree that must be avoided when a simpler procedure of analysis is possible. This argument is based on the second part of the principle of simplicity, which states if several methods yield equally simple description, it is necessary to choose the one which leads to the results through the simplest procedure. This part of the argument provides par excellence an example of the restriction that should be applied to catalysis in glossematics. Thus, Hjelmslev generalizes this interpretation to all types of sentences and proclaims his next statement, which is a general theorem. So-called verbal morphemes belong to the sentence taken as a whole, not merely to the verb. Hjelmslev called them extense morphemes, which are contrary to the intense morphemes. The latter belongs to the nouns. As Graffi had also mentioned, this conclusion anticipates more recent views. For example, partly in one of the most important developments in Chomsky's generative grammar, especially since his government and binding theory, in which the inflection tense plus agreement is no longer attributed to the verb but to the entire sentence. So now it's clear that the statements 5 and 6 refute definitively the general law in the classical doctrine. Moreover, concerning the general theorem 6, which states that the extense morphemes don't belong to the verb itself, and referring to the distinction between extense and intense morphemes, Hjelmslev concludes that in a sentence that verb is a biradical, while the nouns are the radicals which covered with intense morphemes. From there, he states his next general theorem, which is about the relation between verbs and nouns. Any verb, biradical, can in principle be transformed into a noun by adding nominal morphemes, more precisely fundamental intense morphemes. In this way, Hjelmslev manifestly refused the Meillet's general theorem, according to which verbs and nouns were supposed to be two opposed types of words. Finally, taking into account these three substituted statements, the verb cannot be any more defined as a conjugated word. And therefore, the general definition in the classical doctrine is disproved as a matter of course. So in this way, Hjelmslev has completely refuted the statements of classical doctrine, or one can rightly say the doctrine of Meillet. What remains is to provide an alternative general definition for the very concept verb. This will bring us to the world of Glossematics. So he defined verb as the conjunction of propositions. It seems like an easy task for the theorist of Glossematic to provide such a formal definition from his enormous labyrinthine calculus, but it is not at all easy for his readers to pursue his unconventional theoretical system. Here, I don't intend to open up this definition in the Glossematic maze, nor to go further and demonstrate a potential syntax in Hjelmslev's stroke theory. I content myself with a simple commentary on what we face in his article encompassing this definition of verb. To support his definition, Hjelmslev supplies it with a concise account of a selection of simplified definitions from his stroke theory. This is reported only in 1 page and a half before the closing paragraph of his study. Here, you can see a schematic representation of the hierarchy of the relations between these definitions. We have no time to discuss this hierarchy. I simply indicate that these concepts are not sufficient to have a glossematic sub-theory of the sentence structure. I interpret these indications rather as an invitation to a syntactic commitment within the Sprague theory. To conclude, I would like to mention from a glossematic point of view some advantages that can be gained from reading Hjelmslev's study on nominal sentences. It is a fine example of how Hjelmslev brings his glossematics into dialogue with other linguistic approaches and traditions. It's also a prime example of use of some glossematic tools in practical analysis, in particular those of commutation test, catalysis, and principle of simplicity. In addition, it provides a perfect example of how the premised linguistic experience and the relevant data can be supplied. It can also serve as a promising point of departure for engaging with glossematics from a syntactic point of view. At this last point, I would like to suggest how we can pursue the analysis of sentences in the works of Hjelmslev to infer, or one can say, to reconstruct a glossematic syntactic subtheory that I like to be able to do in some extent, in my future researches. It would be necessary to go back to the theoretical devices in at least 4 other sources. First and foremost, the resume of a theory of language, which provides the totality of the stroke theory, but without any practical explanation or examples of application. Second, essai d'une théorie des morphèmes, where one can find some clear explanations and examples, mainly on categories called morphemes. Next, glossematic procedure that can be found as an annex in Badir's Epistemologie linguistique, which is a summary of the procedure of the glossematic analysis of linguistic text. And Hjelmslev's speech of November the 3rd, 1949, within the Linguistic Circle of Copenhagen on syntactic analysis as an intermediate stage in the glossematic procedure. So, yeah, that's all. Thank you so much for your interest and attention.
Thanks for this presentation, and it was a pleasure to hear about Hjelmslev, who is not so well known today. So I don't know if there. Well, that's a concurrency for the cloister of Milan. So thanks, Madame.